The musty smell hit them first, followed by a wave of heat that seemed to have been trapped in the attic for decades. Rachel wiped sweat from her forehead as she surveyed the cramped space filled with forgotten treasures, or so the estate sale advertisement had claimed. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Rachel and Marcus Thompson had driven 3 hours to this estate sale in the suburbs of Cleveland, chasing another lead in their increasingly desperate attempt to save their vintage collectibles shop. The morning fog had barely lifted when they'd arrived at the Victorian mansion, its weathered shingles and overgrown garden suggesting years of neglect. The estate sale coordinator, a sharp-eyed woman named Gladys, had mentioned the attic contents as an afterthought. "Previous buyers picked through the good stuff downstairs," she'd said, gesturing vaguely upward. "But the attic's still sealed. Family said it hadn't been opened in 40 years. $200 takes everything up there as is. Where is?" Marcus had hesitated. $200 was grocery money for the next 2 weeks. But Rachel, ever the optimist despite their circumstances, had seen possibility where others saw junk. It was this same optimism that had kept them going after the fire destroyed half their inventory 6 months ago, after the insurance company found a loophole to deny their claim, after their daughter Emma had to drop out of college because they could no longer afford tuition. "We'll take it." Rachel had declared fishing crumpled 20s from her purse before Marcus could object. Now, standing in the suffocating attic, Marcus wondered if his wife's eternal optimism had finally led them astray. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through a single octagonal window. Boxes towered precariously, their contents hidden beneath decades of grime. Old furniture draped in, yellowed sheets created ghostly silhouettes in the corners. "Maybe we should have looked first," Marcus muttered, testing a floorboard that creaked ominously under his weight. Rachel was already pulling back a sheet from what appeared to be an old dresser. "You know what I always say, fortune favors the brave. Besides, look at this craftsmanship." She ran her fingers along the carved wood. "This alone might be worth what we paid." They had met 32 years ago at an estate sale, not unlike this one. Marcus, fresh out of business school, had been dragged along by his antique-dealing uncle. Rachel, an art history graduate student, was hunting for pieces for her thesis on American folk art. They'd both reached for the same Depression-era glass bowl, their hands touching in that cliched but undeniable moment of connection. "You take it," Marcus had said, charmed by her enthusiasm as she explained the bowl's significance. "Only if you let me buy you coffee to make up for it," she'd replied. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into a relationship, and eventually into a marriage built on shared passions, history, craftsmanship, and the stories objects carried within them. They'd opened Thompson's Vintage Finds 15 years ago, turning their hobby into a livelihood that supported their family and fed their souls. But the past 2 years had tested every foundation they'd built. The pandemic had decimated foot traffic. Online competition from massive corporations had siphoned away customers. Then came the fire electrical, the investigators said, probably from the building's ancient wiring. Half their carefully curated inventory reduced to ash in hours. Pieces they'd spent years acquiring, each with its own story, gone. The insurance company's rejection had been the final blow. Some fine print about the building's code violations that their landlord had hidden. Suddenly, they were facing bankruptcy, struggling to keep the doors open with a devastated inventory and mounting debts. Their daughter Emma had been in her junior year at Ohio State, studying to become a teacher. The night they'd told her they could no longer afford her tuition, she'd tried to hide her devastation. "It's okay," Emma had said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I'll take a gap year, work, save up. Lots of people do it." But Rachel had seen the acceptance letter to the study abroad program in Florence, tucked under Emma's laptop, the program her daughter had dreamed about since high school, now another casualty of their financial crisis. "This heat is unbearable," Marcus said, bringing Rachel back to the present. He'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the scar on his forearm from trying to salvage inventory during the fire. "Let's at least open that window, get some air circulation." The window proved stubborn, its frame swollen with decades of humidity. Marcus wrestled with it while Rachel began methodically opening boxes, her movements careful despite the oppressive heat. This was their system. He handled the heavy lifting and negotiations. She did the evaluation and research. 30 years of partnership had created an efficient rhythm, even in the most challenging circumstances. The first few boxes yielded predictable contents: moldering clothing, water-damaged books, holiday decorations, so old the colors had faded to uniform beige. Rachel cataloged each item in her notebook, ever hopeful that something valuable might emerge. A complete set of vintage Pyrex bowls brought a small smile. Those could fetch $40 to the right collector. Small victories, she murmured, Marcus's oft-repeated phrase when they found modest treasures. Marcus finally conquered the window, and a breeze carrying the scent of impending rain provided blessed relief. He joined Rachel in the excavation, working through a stack of boxes near what appeared to be an old chimney. "Look at this," he said, pulling out a leather-bound photo album. The pages chronicled a family's life from the 1,940 seconds through the 1,970 seconds, weddings, birthdays, holiday gatherings. The Hartley family, he read from careful handwriting beneath one photo. James and Dorothy, married the 15th of June, 1947. Rachel peered over his shoulder. "That must be whose estate this is. Look how happy they were." The photos showed a progression familiar to anyone who'd lived through mid-century America. Young couple in post-war optimism, growing family in suburban prosperity, children scattered to their own lives. Then later photos of just James and Dorothy, silver-haired but still smiling, though something in their eyes suggested the loneliness that often accompanied long life. They spent an hour going through photo albums and letters, piecing together the Hartley family story. James had been a factory supervisor at a steel mill. Dorothy had taught elementary school. They'd raised 4 children in this house, hosting legendary neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties. The letters revealed family tensions too: a son who'd moved to California and rarely visited, a daughter whose husband James had never approved of, grandchildren who grew up as strangers. "It's always sad, isn't it?" Rachel said softly. "How families drift apart. All these memories, and no one wanted them enough to keep them." Marcus squeezed her shoulder. He knew she was thinking of Emma, of the distance that financial hardship could create, even in the closest families. Emma called less frequently now, careful not to burden them with stories of the opportunities she was missing. They returned to the boxes with renewed purpose. If nothing else, they were giving these abandoned memories a few more moments of attention before deciding their fate. The next hour yielded more modest finds: a set of brass candlesticks that would polish up nicely, vintage board games that collectors sought, a beautiful hand-sewn quilt that had miraculously avoided moth damage. "We might actually break even on this," Marcus said, his natural pessimism lightening slightly. Rachel had moved to a corner where boxes had been stacked against what looked like an old armoire. These boxes were different, newer, though still coated in dust, and sealed with tape rather than simply folded closed. "Help me move these," she said. Together they shifted the boxes, revealing the armoire fully. It was a beautiful piece, solid mahogany with intricate carved details, the kind of furniture that would centerpiece their shop if they still had a shop in 6 months. "This alone could be worth 1,000, Marcus breathed, running his hands over the wood. "Maybe more to the right buyer." Rachel was already working on the locked doors with the set of picks. She always carried a skill learned from her locksmith father. The lock surrendered with a satisfying click, and the doors swung open to reveal more boxes. But these were different. Metal containers, the kind used for long-term storage, each one labeled with years: 1952, 1953, 1954, continuing through 1969. "What do you think?" Marcus asked. "Only one way to find out." Rachel lifted the 1952 box, surprised by its weight. She set it on a clearer section of floor and carefully removed the lid. Inside, protected by layers of tissue paper, were baseball cards, dozens of them, each in individual sleeves. Marcus picked up one randomly. "Mickey Mantle," he read, 1952 tops. "This is his rookie card, Rachel." Rachel's hands had started trembling. She knew enough about collectibles to understand what they might have found: A 1,952 Topps Mickey Mantle in good condition could be worth. She couldn't even complete the thought. "We need to be very careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Use the cotton gloves in my kit. Don't touch the cards directly." With shaking hands, they donned the gloves and began examining the cards more carefully. The Mantle card was in extraordinary condition, centered, sharp corners, vivid colors. It looked as if it had been pulled from a pack yesterday rather than 70 years ago. "There's more," Marcus said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Willie Mays rookie, Eddie Matthews. This entire box is rookie cards from 1,952. Rachel had moved to the 1,953 box. Jackie Robinson, Satchel Paige. "Oh my God, Marcus, there's a whole section of Negro League players here." They worked in stunned silence, carefully examining box after box. Each year's collection was meticulously organized, the cards protected in a way that suggested someone who understood their value, or at least their potential value. The condition was unprecedented. Most vintage cards showed wear, damage from being handled by children, stored in bicycle spokes, traded on playgrounds. These looked untouched. "There must be thousands of cards here," Marcus said, "all in mint condition. How is this possible?" Rachel had found something else in the 1954 box, a letter, carefully preserved in plastic. She read it aloud. "Dear Dorothy, I know you think I'm foolish, spending my bonus money on baseball cards, but these aren't just pictures on cardboard. They're history. They're the story of America changing, of barriers breaking down. Jackie Robinson isn't just a ball player, he's a symbol of what's possible. I'm saving these for our children and their children. Someday, they'll be worth something, not just money, but memories, proof that their grandfather saw history being made and thought to preserve it. All my love, James P.S. I promise this is the last box this year, unless they make a special Ted Williams card." "He knew," Rachel said softly. "He wasn't just collecting, he was documenting history." They found more letters as they worked, piecing together James Hartley's philosophy. He'd been deeply affected by serving alongside black soldiers in World War II, returning home to find them barred from the same opportunities he enjoyed. Baseball's integration had represented hope to him, and he'd collected cards not just of stars, but of every player who broke barriers, the first Latino players, the first Asian players after the war, Jewish players who faced discrimination. "Look at this," Marcus said, holding up a card from the 1,969 box. "Curt Flood. Most people don't even know who he was, but James has a whole section on him with newspaper clippings about his fight against the reserve clause." Rachel found notebooks too, James's careful handwriting recording where he'd bought each card, how much he'd paid, and why that player mattered. The entries revealed a man who saw baseball as a lens for understanding American society. By the 1,962 boxes, the cards were accompanied by photos. James, with his young son at baseball games, teaching him about the players, their statistics, their stories. The son looked engaged in the early photos, but as the years progressed, his interest clearly waned. Teenage sullenness replaced childhood enthusiasm. "This is heartbreaking," Rachel said, reading a 1,967 entry. "David told me today that baseball is stupid, that I care more about dead history than living present. Maybe he's right, but someday he'll understand that history isn't dead, it lives in the stories we preserve." The final metal box, labeled 1969, contained a different sort of treasure. Along with that year's cards was a safety deposit box key and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. Marcus read it, his voice catching, "I'm writing this in 1993, as Dorothy insists we clean out the attic. She doesn't know I've hidden this collection back here. Our children have made it clear they have no interest in my worthless baseball cards. They remember the arguments about money spent on cards instead of vacations, time spent organizing collections instead of at their events. They're not entirely wrong. I let my passion become an obsession, but I still believe these cards matter. Not for their monetary value, though I suspect that will be substantial someday, but for what they represent. A record of when America started becoming what it promised to be, one baseball player at a time." The key is to a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Cleveland, Box 447. Inside, you'll find the crown jewels of my collection cards I bought when the market crashed in the early 82nds and dealers were desperate. Cards that should be in a museum, but instead sat in a failing sports memorabilia shop until I rescued them. If you're reading this, you've shown more curiosity about this old attic than my children ever did. I hope you'll appreciate what you found. More than that, I hope you'll understand why I saved them. History isn't just in textbooks. It's in the stories of people who did extraordinary things, even if that thing was just playing a game well enough to inspire others. Do something good with them. James Hartley. Rachel was crying openly now. This wasn't just a valuable find, it was a life's passion, abandoned and forgotten. She thought of their own shop, filled with objects they'd rescued from similar fates, each one carrying stories that deserved preservation. "We have to go to that bank," Marcus said. "If the safety deposit box still exists after all these years." "First, we need to secure these cards," Rachel said, switching to practical mode despite her emotions. "We can't leave them here, and we need to research values before we make any decisions." They spent the next 2 hours carefully packing the metal boxes into their van, wrapped in the quilts they'd found for extra protection. The armoire would have to wait for a return trip with proper equipment. The rest of the attic's contents suddenly seemed inconsequential compared to their discovery. As they prepared to leave, Rachel noticed something they'd overlooked, a small box tucked behind where the armoire had stood. Inside were family photos from the 1,980 and 90 showing an older James with his baseball cards, organizing them, showing them to uninterested grandchildren. In the last photos, he was alone with his collection, Dorothy apparently having given up trying to share his enthusiasm. The final photo showed James at what must have been his 80th birthday party, surrounded by family but looking somehow isolated. In the background, barely visible, was a 1,952 mantle card in a frame on the wall, the beginning of a collection that had consumed so much of his life. "Let's go," Marcus said gently, seeing how the photos affected Rachel. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." The drive home was quiet, both of them processing what they'd found. The afternoon sky had darkened with approaching storms, and they drove carefully, precious cargo in the back. "What do we do?" Marcus finally asked as they neared Columbus. "If these cards are worth what I think they might be worth?" "We do what James asked," Rachel said firmly. "We do something good with them." "But Rachel, if that 1,952 mantle alone is worth what comparable cards have sold for, we're talking about potentially millions of dollars. We could save the shop, pay for Emma's college, help other struggling businesses." "I know," Rachel said, "but we need to do this right. Research everything, understand what we have, maybe reach out to James's family." "The family that abandoned all of this in an attic for 40 years? Rachel sighed. He was right, of course, but something about James's letters, his careful preservation, his hope that someone would understand it, demanded more than just rushing to auction. They reached their shop as the first raindrops began to fall. The going out of business sale sign Emma had helped them paint still hung in the window, though they'd extended their closing date twice now, unwilling to finally admit defeat. The sight of it after their discovery felt surreal. Working together with practiced efficiency, they transferred the boxes to their climate-controlled storage room, the one part of the shop the fire hadn't touched. Once everything was secure, they finally allowed themselves to research what they'd found. Marcus pulled up recent auction results on his laptop, while Rachel carefully photographed select cards for documentation. What they discovered left them speechless. A 1,952 Topps Mickey Mantle in mint condition had sold the previous year for $12.6 million. The Willie Mays rookie in similar condition had fetched $6.06 million, and those were just individual cards. They had found hundreds, possibly thousands, all in extraordinary condition. "This can't be real," Marcus said, running calculations. "Even conservatively, even if most of these are worth just thousands instead of millions, we're looking at." "The safety deposit box," Rachel interrupted. "James said the crown jewels were in there. What could be more valuable than what we already found?" They looked up the bank James had mentioned. It had been absorbed by a larger bank in a merger, but the main branch still existed downtown. Whether a safety deposit box from 1993 would still be accessible was another question. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in their small apartment above the shop, downsized from their house after the fire, and talked through possibilities and implications. We could auction them individually, Marcus suggested. Maximize value, maybe keep a few meaningful ones. Or we could sell the entire collection to a museum, Rachel countered. Keep James's vision intact. What about a combination? Sell enough to solve our immediate problems, then find the right home for the rest. They debated ethics too. Was it right to profit from someone else's lifelong passion? But then again, James himself had said to do something good with them. Saving their business, providing for their daughter, helping their community, wasn't that good? I keep thinking about those photos, Rachel said in the darkness. How alone he looked at the end, surrounded by cards no one else cared about. But he was right, Marcus pointed out. He saw their value when no one else did. Historical, cultural, and yes, monetary value. That takes vision, or obsession. How many family moments did he miss organizing those cards? How much resentment built up over money spent on cardboard instead of family needs? It was a conversation that hit close to home. Their own business had demanded sacrifices, missed school events, delayed vacations, the constant stress that affected family dinners. Had they been any different from James Hartley? Maybe that's why we found them, Marcus said finally. We understand the cost of passion. We can honor his collection while learning from his mistakes. The next morning came too soon. They dressed carefully, as if preparing for a momentous occasion rather than a simple bank visit. The branch manager, Miss Patterson, was intrigued by their story and the old safety deposit box key. Let me check our records, she said, typing into her computer. Box 447. Yes, it's still active. Paid up for 30 years in advance in 1993. Mr. Hartley was apparently very forward-thinking. She led them to the vault, where box 447 waited in a wall of identical metal doors. The key turned smoothly, as if it had been used yesterday, rather than sitting in an attic for decades. Inside the long metal box were 3 items: a smaller box, an envelope, and a leather journal. Rachel opened the envelope first. It contained documentation, certificates of authenticity, purchase receipts, detailed provenance for what was in the smaller box. Her hands trembled as she read the inventory. Marcus, she whispered. It's a complete 1,933 goodie set, including all 4 Babe Ruth cards, in gem mint condition. Marcus had to sit down on the small bench in the vault room. The 1933 goodie set was the holy grail of vintage baseball cards. A complete set in top condition was almost unheard of. Individual Ruth cards from that set sold for millions. The leather journal contained more of James's writings, but these entries were different, more philosophical, written with the perspective of age. I bought these cards in 1983. One entry read, when the country was in recession and a dealer's wife had left him, taking their children. He needed money for lawyers more than he needed baseball cards. I paid him fairly more than he asked, less than they were worth even then. I told him that someday they'd be worth enough to pay for his grandchildren's college. He laughed bitterly and said he'd probably never see his children again, let alone grandchildren. I thought of him often over the years, how we sacrifice relationships for things, even when those things are meant to honor relationships. I collected cards to connect with my children, to teach them history. Instead, I taught them that objects mattered more than presents. Dorothy forgave me, as she forgave all my foolishness. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. My children tolerate me. My grandchildren don't know me. I have the most valuable baseball card collection in private hands, and no one to share it with. So I share it with you, stranger. You who showed enough curiosity to explore a forgotten attic, enough persistence to follow clues. Use this wisely. The money these represent is staggering. I've kept up with auction prices. But remember, they're just cardboard and ink. What matters is the stories they tell and the connections they create. Don't let them become your obsession. Let them be your tool for good. One more thing in my research. I discovered that the dealer I bought these from did reconcile with his family. His daughter became a teacher, his son a social worker. Perhaps the money I paid him helped. I hope so. I hope something good came from all of this. James Hartley, the 15th of February 2010. Rachel closed the journal, tears flowing freely now. Marcus put his arm around her, his own eyes wet. He understood, Rachel said. At the end, he understood what he'd lost and what he'd gained. They carefully secured everything and returned to their shop. What followed were weeks of intense activity. They contacted auction houses, authentication services, and insurance companies. Word of their discovery leaked despite their efforts at discretion, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the Hartley collection. But Rachel and Marcus had made their decision even before the authentication came back, confirming what they already knew, that they had discovered one of the most valuable sports memorabilia finds in history. They would honor James Hartley's wishes, but in their own way. What happens next will turn this discovery into something beyond monetary value, reveal connections across generations, and remind us why sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we keep, but in what we share. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The first call came from Harrison Shaw, CEO of Shaw Sports Memorabilia, the largest vintage card dealer in the country. He offered to fly out immediately with a blank check. "Name your price," he said over the phone. "I'll buy the entire collection, sight unseen, based on your inventory list alone." Rachel politely declined. The second call came from Christie's Auction House, then Sotheby's, then private collectors from around the world. The figures mentioned grew astronomical: $50 million, $75 million, eventually surpassing $100 million for the complete collection. But Rachel and Marcus had different plans. They contacted a lawyer, Patricia Chin, who specialized in nonprofit organizations and charitable giving. "We want to establish a foundation," Rachel explained. "The James Hartley Foundation for Preserving American Stories." Patricia leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Marcus outlined their vision, selling select cards to establish an endowment, with proceeds funding programs that connect generations through shared stories, grants for small museums, oral history projects, and family heritage programs, scholarships for students studying American history and culture, support for struggling small businesses that served as community anchors. "And the crown jewel cards?" Patricia asked. "They go on tour," Rachel said. "Free exhibitions at libraries, schools, community centers. Places where kids who could never afford to see them at auction houses can learn the stories behind them." They refined the plan over several weeks. 30% of the collection would be sold at auction to fund the foundation. Another 30% would be donated to museums across the country, not just the big names, but small-town museums that told local stories. The remaining 40%, including the most valuable cards, would belong to the foundation for educational purposes. The announcement of their plans created a sensation. Sports collectors were aghast that such valuable cards wouldn't go to the highest bidder. Some financial advisors publicly called them foolish for giving away a fortune. But letters of support poured in from educators, historians, and ordinary people moved by their story. One letter stood out. It came from David Hartley, James's son. "I read about your discovery in the newspaper," he wrote. "I should be angry that strangers will benefit from my father's collection. But the truth is, I'm relieved and grateful. You understand what I never did, that my father wasn't just collecting baseball cards. He was trying to connect with something larger than himself. I resented those cards my entire childhood. They represented every school play he missed. He was at a card show. Every family vacation cut short to visit card dealers. Every argument about money. But reading your plans, seeing how you want to use them, I think Dad would be overjoyed. You're doing what he always wanted to do but didn't know how, using his passion to bring people together instead of driving them apart. I'm 67 now, retired after a career I never loved because I was so busy rebelling against my father's passions that I never developed my own. My own children barely know me." The cycle continued. "If you'd like, I have boxes of my father's writings about baseball and history that I saved despite myself. They might be useful for your foundation's educational programs. And perhaps I could volunteer. I know more about those cards than I ever wanted to admit. Maybe it's time I understood why they mattered so much to him." Rachel called David immediately. Their conversation lasted 3 hours, filled with laughter, tears, and the beginning of an unexpected friendship. The first auction, featuring 100 cards from the 1,950 seconds, raised $8.7 million. The highlight was a 1,954 Henry Aaron rookie card that sold for $1.3 million to a collector who announced he would loan it to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. With initial funding secured, the foundation officially launched. Emma, who had returned from college to help her parents, became the foundation's first program director. Her experience with financial hardship had given her ideas about making history accessible to all economic backgrounds. "We're going to have traveling trunks," she explained to the board, which included David Hartley, Patricia Chin, several educators, and a baseball historian. Replicas of the valuable cards, historical materials, lesson plans. Teachers can check them out like library books. The first trunk went to McKinley Elementary in inner-city Cleveland, the same school where Dorothy Hartley had taught. The fourth graders' excitement at holding replica cards of players they'd never heard of, but whose stories captivated them, validated everything Rachel and Marcus hoped to achieve. 6 months into the foundation's operation, they held their first major exhibition at the Cleveland Public Library. Breaking Barriers, the James Hartley Collection, and the integration of baseball featured not just cards but historical context, oral histories from Negro League players, and interactive displays. David Hartley gave the opening address. "My father believed baseball cards were history you could hold in your hand," he said. "I spent my life resenting that belief. But watching children's faces light up as they learn about Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, and Satchel Paige, I finally understand. These aren't just pictures on cardboard. They're gateways to understanding who we were and who we're becoming." The exhibition's centerpiece was the 1,933 Babe Ruth cards, displayed with letters from young fans during the Depression, showing how baseball provided hope during hard times. But equally prominent were cards of lesser-known players who'd broken barriers. Pumpsie Green, the first black player on the Boston Red Sox. Masanori Murakami, the first Japanese player in the major leagues after World War II. Roberto Clemente, whose humanitarian work off the field matched his excellence on it. Marcus and Rachel stood at the back of the crowded opening, watching families explore the exhibits together. A grandfather explained to his granddaughter about watching Hank Aaron chase Babe Ruth's home run record despite death threats. A young boy studied cards of Latino players, proudly pointing out those who shared his heritage. "James would have loved this," Rachel murmured. "I think he does love it," Marcus replied. "Wherever he is." Their shop, Thompson's Vintage Finds, had been saved by the initial auction proceeds, but its mission had evolved. Now it specialized in helping families preserve and share their own histories. The memory mapping workshops Rachel ran helped people organize family artifacts and stories. Marcus taught restoration techniques for preserving old photos and documents. Emma had returned to finish her degree, but with a new focus. She changed her major to public history with a minor in museum studies. Her thesis on democratic collecting, how the James Hartley Foundation reimagines cultural preservation, won her university's award for undergraduate research. "You gave me something better than tuition money," she told her parents. "You gave me purpose." The second year brought unexpected challenges. Some valuable cards were damaged during transport, though thankfully insured. A promised corporate sponsorship fell through. Competition from for-profit memorabilia companies trying to capitalize on the renewed interest in vintage cards created conflicts. But there were triumphs too. A foundation-funded oral history project in Birmingham recorded stories from fans who'd attended Negro League games, preserving memories that would have otherwise been lost. A scholarship recipient, the first in his family to attend college, wrote to say he was majoring in history because of a foundation exhibition he'd seen in high school. David Hartley became one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. He traveled with exhibitions, sharing not just his father's story, but his own journey from resentment to understanding. At one school presentation, a student asked if he wished his father had spent less time with baseball cards and more time with family. David's answer was honest. "Yes, but I also wish I'd tried to understand why they mattered to him. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. That's why these cards matter. They're teaching tools for more than just baseball history." The third year brought the Foundation's most ambitious project, partnering with the Library of Congress to digitize the entire collection, making high-resolution images and accompanying historical materials available free online. The announcement drew criticism from collectors who argued it would decrease the card's value. Rachel addressed this at a collectors' convention where she'd been invited to speak. "Value isn't just monetary," she said. James Hartley spent his life preserving these cards because he believed they had historical value, cultural value, educational value. Making them accessible to everyone doesn't diminish that, it amplifies it. A kid in rural Alaska can now study the same cards that would cost millions to own. A teacher in Mississippi can build lesson plans around them. A researcher in Japan can explore how American baseball influenced their own leagues. That's the real value of the Hartley collection. The digitization project took 18 months and resulted in the most comprehensive online baseball card archive ever created. Each card was accompanied by player biographies, historical context, and related primary sources. The site's educational section, designed with Emma's input, made complex historical topics accessible to different age groups. Launch day saw over 1 million visitors. Servers crashed from the volume, a problem they'd never imagined having. Messages poured in from around the world, teachers planning lessons, researchers finding new angles for papers, fans discovering players they'd never known. One message came from the grandson of the card dealer who'd sold James the 1,933 Goody set during his divorce. "My grandfather talked about that sale his whole life," he wrote. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. The money did help him reconnect with his family. He always wondered what happened to those cards. Knowing they're being used to educate and inspire, he would have been so proud. By the fourth year, the Foundation had established partnerships with schools in all 50 states. The traveling trunk program had expanded to include artifacts beyond cards, vintage equipment, uniforms, and recordings of player interviews. Virtual reality experiences let students attend historic games, seeing the crowds and feeling the atmosphere of baseball's integration era. Marcus had developed a particular interest in the preservation side of the work. He'd become an expert in paper conservation, teaching workshops at museums on protecting fragile collections. His manual, Preserving the Past, A Practical Guide to Conservation for Small Museums, became a standard reference. Rachel focused on the storytelling aspects, working with communities to develop their own history projects. The Foundation's model inspired similar initiatives in other collecting areas: vintage toys, historical documents, and family photographs. "It's not about the objects," she would tell workshop participants. "It's about the connections they create between past and present, between generations, between communities." The 5th anniversary of finding the collection called for celebration. The Foundation organized a gala at the Cleveland Museum of Art, bringing together everyone who'd been part of the journey. David Hartley gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes. "5 years ago, 2 strangers climbed into my father's dusty attic and found his life's work," he said. "They could have simply gotten rich. Instead, they got something better. They got to change lives. My father collected cards, hoping to connect with his children. He failed with me, but through Rachel and Marcus, through this foundation, he's connected with thousands of children. That's redemption." The gala raised funds for the Foundation's newest initiative, supporting senior centers and creating their own oral history projects. The pilot program in Shaker Heights had been remarkably successful, with elderly residents sharing stories sparked by seeing cards of players from their youth. Emma, now the Foundation's associate director, announced the expansion. "Every community has stories worth preserving. We're going to help them do it." The success hadn't come without sacrifice. Running a foundation while maintaining their shop meant long hours. They'd miss family gatherings and postpone vacations. Sometimes, late at night, they wondered if they were repeating James Hartley's mistakes, letting passion override presence. But then they'd receive a letter from a student who discovered a love of history through their programs, or see a grandmother and grandchild bonding over cards at an exhibition, and they'd remember why they'd chosen this path. Balance. Marcus would remind them both. "James forgot balance. We won't." The 7th year brought an unexpected honor. The National Baseball Hall of Fame announced that Rachel and Marcus would receive the Buck O'Neil Lifetime Achievement Award for their contributions to preserving baseball history. Standing at the podium in Cooperstown, Rachel looked out at the audience filled with baseball legends, historians, and educators. She thought of James Hartley, alone with his cards in that attic, hoping someone would understand their value. "We're not collectors," she began. "We're not even baseball experts. We're just people who found a treasure in an attic and tried to honor the man who saved it." James Hartley believed baseball cards could tell the story of America becoming what it promised to be. We've tried to help tell that story. But the real heroes are the educators who use these materials, the students who engage with history through them, the communities that have embraced their own storytelling. We just provided tools. You've built something beautiful with them. The standing ovation that followed included David Hartley in the front row, tears streaming down his face. After the ceremony, a young man approached them. He introduced himself as Miguel Rodriguez, one of their first scholarship recipients. "I graduated last month," he said, "starting a job at the Smithsonian in the fall. None of it would have happened without the foundation. You didn't just give me money for school, you gave me a path." These moments, personal, profound, impossible to quantify, were the true measures of success. The 10th anniversary approached with the foundation firmly established as a national model for democratic cultural preservation. The traveling exhibitions had reached over 1 million students. The Oral History Project had recorded thousands of stories. The scholarship program had supported hundreds of students. But Rachel and Marcus were beginning to feel their age. Running the shop and staying involved with the foundation was becoming more demanding. They'd been discussing succession planning, wanting to ensure the foundation's work continued beyond them. Emma had ideas. What if we created a fellowship program, bring in young professionals to learn the foundation's model and take it back to their communities? It was brilliant. The James Hartley Fellowship would train the next generation of public historians and museum professionals in accessible, community-centered cultural preservation. The anniversary celebration was held not in a fancy venue, but at McKinley Elementary, where the first traveling trunk had been delivered. The gymnasium was filled with students, teachers, community members, and special guests from across the country. David Hartley, now the foundation's board chair, introduced the newest initiative, the Hartley Homes Program. The Victorian house where the collection had been discovered, purchased with foundation funds, would become a center for teaching conservation techniques to small museums and family collectors. "My childhood home will finally host the workshops my father dreamed of," David said, "not about collecting for profit, but preserving for purpose." Rachel thought about the day they'd climb those attic stairs, desperate and nearly defeated. How different life had become because they'd taken a chance on a dusty space everyone else had ignored. During the reception, she found herself in conversation with a reporter who asked the question everyone wondered. "Did you ever regret not keeping all that money for yourselves?" Rachel looked across the room at Marcus, teaching a young boy how to hold a card properly, at Emma, explaining the fellowship program to eager graduate students, at David Hartley, surrounded by children, asking about his father's cards. Every dollar we didn't keep became a story preserved, a connection made, a life changed, she said. How could we regret that? As the event wound down, Rachel and Marcus walked through the exhibition set up in the school hallways. The cards were displayed not by value, but by story. Barrier breakers, hometown heroes, players who'd overcome adversity. They paused at the display case containing the 1,952 Mickey Mantle card that had started it all. Next to it was a photo they'd found in the attic, young James Hartley with his son at a baseball game, both smiling, the promise of connection not yet broken by obsession. "He got his wish in the end," Marcus said softly. "Which wish?" Rachel asked. "All of them. His cards are in museums. They're teaching history. They're bringing families together. And someone understood why he saved them. They stood quietly, two people in their 70s who'd found unexpected purpose and unexpected treasure. Through the gymnasium doors, they could hear children laughing, stories being shared, connections being made. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked. Rachel took his hand. "One more minute. I want to remember this." So they stood there, surrounded by history preserved and stories told, knowing they'd done exactly what James Hartley had asked. Something good. The drive home was peaceful, both of them content in the silence that comes from shared accomplishment. Their phone buzzed with messages, thank yous from attendees, queries from reporters, scheduling requests from schools wanting exhibitions. "Tomorrow," Rachel said, silencing the phone. "Tonight, let's just be us." They climbed the stairs to their apartment above the shop, the same stairs they'd climbed after losing everything to the fire. After nearly losing hope, the shop below was dark, but tomorrow it would fill again with people seeking to preserve their own stories, inspired by what the Hartley collection had become. On their kitchen table sat a package that had arrived that morning, marked, "Personal, please open together." Inside was a card, a 1955 Roberto Clemente rookie, with a note. "My grandmother was one of Clemente's biggest fans. She saved this card for 60 years, keeping it in her Bible. After seeing your exhibition, I wanted you to have it not for the foundation, but for you personally. Because sometimes the people who help others preserve their treasures deserve treasures of their own. With gratitude, Maria Santos." Rachel propped the card on their mantle, next to photos of Emma, their shop, and moments from the foundation's journey. "We did good," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her. "We did good," she agreed. Outside, Cleveland sparkled in the darkness, a city of stories waiting to be discovered and preserved. Somewhere in attics and basements, in forgotten boxes and abandoned albums, more treasures waited for someone curious enough to look, brave enough to see their true value. The James Hartley Foundation would help find them, preserve them, and share them. But it had started with two people willing to pay $200 for a dusty attic's contents, seeing possibility where others saw junk. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't in what we find, but in what we choose to do with our discoveries. Rachel and Marcus Thompson had chosen to transform personal gain into public good, to honor a stranger's legacy by extending it beyond his dreams. And in that choice, they'd found something more valuable than the millions they'd given away: purpose, community, and the knowledge that some treasures are too precious to keep for ourselves. The cards would continue to tell their stories of barriers broken, dreams pursued, and history preserved. But the greatest story would be of James Hartley, who saved history in an attic, and the couple who found it and set it free. The morning after the anniversary celebration, Rachel woke early, as had become her habit over the years. The apartment above the shop was quiet, Marcus still sleeping peacefully beside her. She slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, where the first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the windows. As she prepared her morning tea, her eyes fell on the Roberto Clemente card they'd received the night before. Maria Santos's note had touched her deeply, the idea that they deserved their own treasure after helping so many others preserve theirs. It made her think about the nature of deserving, of earning, of the strange ways life rewarded or punished people's choices. She thought about James Hartley, who had deserved to share his passion with his family but had instead driven them away with his obsession. She thought about their own daughter Emma, who had deserved to study in Florence but had instead found her true calling through adversity. Sometimes what we deserve and what we receive are entirely different things, and sometimes that difference leads us exactly where we need to be. The phone rang, startling her from her reverie. Who would call at 6 in the morning? The caller ID showed an international number. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Mrs. Thompson? This is Professor Kenji Nakamura from Waseda University in Tokyo. I apologize for the early hour. I miscalculated the time difference." Rachel assured him it was fine, curious about the purpose of his call. "I've been following the James Hartley Foundation's work with great interest." Professor Nakamura continued, "Your digitization project has been invaluable to my research on cultural exchange through sports. I'm calling because I've discovered something that might interest you." He explained that while researching the influence of American baseball on Japanese culture, he'd come across correspondence between James Hartley and a Japanese card collector named Hiroshi Tanaka in the 1960 seconds. Mr. Tanaka was trying to document Japanese players who had been scouted by American teams but were prevented from playing due to discriminatory policies. "Professor," Nakamura said, "your James Hartley was one of the few American collectors who showed interest in this hidden history." Rachel gripped the phone tighter. This was exactly the kind of story the Foundation existed to uncover and share. "Mr. Tanaka's grandson still has the letters and a collection of Japanese baseball cards from that era, including players who should have broken barriers but never got the chance. He would like to donate them to your foundation to ensure these forgotten stories are told alongside the celebrated ones. After taking down the contact information and thanking Professor Nakamura profusely, Rachel sat in stunned silence. Even now, years after that dusty attic discovery, James Hartley's passion was still revealing new connections, new stories, new ways to understand history. Marcus found her there an hour later, still sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light now fully illuminating the room. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, pouring himself coffee. "Not a ghost," Rachel replied. "A resurrection. James Hartley's work isn't done yet," she explained the call, watching Marcus's eyes widen with each detail. They both understood the significance, not just the historical value of documenting players' denied opportunities, but the way it connected to contemporary discussions about inclusion and representation. "We'll need to expand the digitization project," Marcus said, already thinking practically. "Maybe create a whole section on players who, almost, were the ones history forgot. And we'll need translators, cultural consultants, historians who understand both American and Japanese baseball history," Rachel added. They spent the morning planning, their excitement building with each idea. Emma called around 9, and they put her on speaker to share the news. "This is exactly what the foundation should be doing," Emma said enthusiastically. "Not just preserving the stories we know, but uncovering the ones we don't. I'll start researching grant opportunities for international cultural exchange projects." By noon, they had the outline of a new initiative, Beyond Barriers, the untold stories of baseball's almost heroes. It would document players from around the world who had been excluded from American baseball due to discrimination, war, or circumstance. David Hartley, when they called him, was moved to tears. "My father would have been overjoyed," he said. He always said the real tragedy wasn't the barriers that were broken, but the talent that was wasted because barriers existed at all. This project honors that perspective. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. The Tanaka family's donation arrived with not just cards and letters, but photographs, scouting reports, and even film reels of Japanese players from the 1,000, 950 seconds, and 60 seconds. The materials revealed a parallel universe of baseball history players whose statistics rivaled American stars, but who never got the chance to prove themselves on integrated fields. One player in particular captured Rachel's attention, Kazuo Yamamoto, a pitcher whose fastball had been clocked at speeds that would have made him a sensation in the major leagues. He'd been scouted by 3 American teams in 1961, but Cold War tensions and lingering prejudices from World War II prevented any offers from materializing. "Look at this." Rachel showed Marcus a letter from an American scout. He says Yamamoto could have been the Japanese Sandy Koufax if given the chance. They discovered that Yamamoto was still alive, in his 80s, living in a small town outside Osaka. Emma immediately began arranging for an oral history interview, working with Professor Nakamura to ensure cultural sensitivity and accurate translation. The interview, conducted via video conference with a translator, was profound. Yamamoto spoke not with bitterness, but with a kind of philosophical acceptance that reminded them of James Hartley's later writings. "Baseball taught me that talent alone is not enough," Yamamoto said through the translator. "You need talent, timing, and society ready to accept you. I had only the first. But I'm grateful my story will now be told. Perhaps young players today will understand how fortunate they are to play in a world with fewer barriers." As word spread about the Beyond Barriers project, similar collections emerged from unexpected places. A Korean family contributed cards and memorabilia from players who had been stars in Korea but were never scouted due to political tensions. A Cuban exile in Miami offered a treasure trove of materials about players who couldn't leave the island during baseball's golden age. Marcus coordinated the physical preservation of these new materials while Rachel focused on the storytelling aspects. They hired a diverse team of researchers, translators, and historians, funding the positions through a combination of grants and private donations from collectors moved by the project's mission. One day, while reviewing newly translated letters, Rachel made a discovery that stunned her. Hidden among Hiroshi Tanaka's correspondence was a carbon copy of a letter James Hartley had never sent, or at least they'd never found the original in his collection. The unsent letter was addressed to the Commissioner of Baseball in 1963, advocating for the active recruitment of Asian players. Baseball calls itself America's pastime, but it could be the world's game. I've been corresponding with collectors in Japan who send me cards of players whose talent equals or exceeds many in our leagues. Yet we ignore this talent because of prejudices that should have died with the last war. I think of my time in the service, fighting alongside men from every background. We trusted each other with our lives regardless of race or origin. If we could do that in war, why can't we do it in peace? On a baseball field? I know this letter will likely be dismissed as the rambling of a card collector with no standing in the sport. But I believe history will judge us harshly for the talent we waste, the stories we refuse to tell, the connections we fail to make. Someday, I hope someone will tell these stories. If not us, then perhaps someone who finds my collection and understands that baseball cards aren't just pictures, they're promises of what could be. Rachel's hand shook as she finished reading. Even in the 1,960 seconds, James had understood. He'd seen beyond his own collection to the stories that weren't being told, the cards that weren't being made. He was advocating for inclusion decades before it became mainstream, Marcus said, reading over her shoulder. He saw the future but couldn't make others see it. They decided to make James's unsent letter the centerpiece of the Beyond Barriers exhibition, showing how one collector had tried to expand the narrative of baseball history even when his voice went unheard. The exhibition opened simultaneously in Cleveland, Tokyo, Seoul, and Havana, connected by live video feeds that allowed visitors to interact across cultures and languages. The opening ceremony featured elderly players from each country sharing their stories, their images projected on large screens so everyone could see the dignity and grace with which they carried their untold histories. Kazuo Yamamoto, despite his age, had flown in for the Cleveland opening. When he saw his baseball card displayed in the same case as Sandy Koufax and Willie Mays, he stood in silence for several minutes. My grandson can now point to this and say, "That was my grandfather," he finally said through the translator. "That's worth more than any contract I never signed." The media coverage was extensive, with sports journalists finally telling stories that had been overlooked for decades. Several major league teams invited the elderly players to throw ceremonial first pitches, acknowledging talents that had been ignored in their prime. But for Rachel and Marcus, the most meaningful moment came during a quiet afternoon at the Cleveland exhibition. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, was studying the displays with intense concentration. Her grandmother stood beside her, translating the English text into Korean. Rachel approached them gently. "Is there a particular player you're interested in?" The grandmother smiled. "My father, her great-grandfather. He played in Korea in the 1,950 seconds. We heard his card might be here." Rachel led them to the Korean section, where they found the card, Park Sung-ho, a center fielder whose statistics were indeed impressive. The young girl's eyes widened as she saw her great-grandfather's image professionally displayed, his story told with the same respect given to Hall of Famers. "She plays baseball," the grandmother explained. "In her league, she's the only Korean girl. Sometimes she feels alone. I wanted her to see that she comes from baseball people. Even if America didn't know about them." The girl said something in Korean, which her grandmother translated. She says now she understands why she loves baseball. It's in her blood, from her great-grandfather. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. This was why they'd done it, not for the valuable cards or the recognition, but for moments like this, when history became personal, when forgotten stories found their audience. As the Beyond Barriers project gained momentum, it began influencing policy discussions. Major League Baseball announced a new initiative to scout and develop talent globally, with emphasis on regions previously overlooked. The Hall of Fame created a new exhibit on international players who had influenced the game even without playing in American leagues. Emma, now recognized as a leading voice in public history, was invited to speak at conferences around the world. Her presentations always began with the story of the dusty attic and her parents' choice to transform personal gain into public good. "Cultural preservation isn't about objects," she would say. Echoing her mother's philosophy, it's about connections between past and present, between cultures, between people who might never meet but who share common passions. The Foundation's work expanded beyond baseball. The model they developed, democratizing access to history, uncovering untold stories, connecting generations, was adapted for other sports, other collectibles, other forms of cultural heritage. Museums contacted them for advice on making their collections more accessible. Libraries sought guidance on oral history projects. Schools developed curricula based on the Foundation's approach to teaching history through personal stories. Marcus, despite his advancing age, threw himself into teaching preservation techniques. His workshops were always full, attracting not just museum professionals, but ordinary people who wanted to save their family treasures. He developed simple, affordable methods that made conservation accessible to anyone. Every family is a museum, he would tell his students. Every photo album is an archive. Every story deserves preservation. Rachel focused on expanding the storytelling workshops, traveling to communities that felt their histories had been overlooked. She worked with indigenous communities preserving their sports traditions, with immigrant communities documenting their contributions to American athletics, with women's sports pioneers whose achievements had been minimized or forgotten. One particularly moving project involved the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the women's league that had operated during World War II. Many of the players were still alive, in their 90s, with stories that had never been properly documented. We were told we were just filling in until the men came back. One former player, Dorothy Mitchell, told Rachel, "But we were athletes. We were pioneers. We showed that women could play professional sports and draw crowds." The Foundation created a special collection for these women, digitizing their photos, uniforms, and memorabilia. When the online archive launched, it crashed again from traffic, not from collectors seeking valuable cards, but from granddaughters discovering their grandmothers had been professional athletes. Through it all, Rachel and Marcus maintained their shop, though it had evolved far from its original incarnation. Thompson's Vintage Finds was now as much a community center as a business. The front room displayed items for sale, but the back rooms hosted workshops, small exhibitions, and gathering spaces for collectors and history enthusiasts. They'd hired assistants to handle day-to-day operations, young people who shared their passion for preservation and storytelling. The shop had become a training ground for the next generation of public historians, many of whom went on to establish similar spaces in their own communities. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, 5 years after the Beyond Barriers project launched, Rachel was working in the shop when the door chimed. She looked up to see a familiar face she hadn't seen in person for over 15 years. "Rebecca?" she gasped. Their daughter stood in the doorway, older now, with streaks of gray in her hair that matched Rachel's own. Beside her stood a tall man who must be her husband, and two teenagers who could only be their grandchildren Rachel had seen only in photos. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry it took so long." The reunion was tearful, complicated, full of explanations and apologies. Rebecca had been living in Australia, yes, but the real distance had been created by misunderstandings, failed communications, and the same kind of drift that had separated James Hartley from his children. "I read about what you and Dad did," Rebecca said later, as they sat in the shop's back room surrounded by the artifacts of their life's work. "About the Foundation, about choosing to give rather than keep. I was so proud, but also so ashamed that I hadn't been part of it. You're here now," Marcus said simply. "That's what matters." Rebecca's children, 16-year-old James and 14-year-old Sarah, were fascinated by their grandparents' story. They'd grown up in Australia knowing little about their American heritage, and suddenly they were surrounded by it. "You really found millions of dollars in baseball cards?" James asked, incredulous. "And gave them away?" Sarah added. Rachel and Marcus exchanged glances, remembering their own debates about that decision years ago. "We kept the most valuable things," Rachel said. "The stories, the connections, the ability to make a difference. Money would have been nice, but what we got instead was better." Rebecca revealed that she'd taken a sabbatical from her work as a teacher in Melbourne. "I want to learn what you do," she said. "I want to be part of this, if you'll have me." The next months were a time of healing and reconnection. Rebecca threw herself into learning the foundation's work, bringing her own skills as an educator to enhance their programs. Her children, initially overwhelmed by their grandparents' fame in the collecting world, gradually found their own connections to the work. Young James discovered a passion for the technical side of preservation, spending hours with Marcus learning about paper conservation and digital archiving. Sarah, more like her grandmother, gravitated toward the storytelling aspects, conducting her first oral history interview with a neighbor who'd played in the Negro Leagues. "It's in the blood," Marcus said one evening, watching Sarah carefully transcribe her interview notes. "Just like that Korean girl whose great-grandfather played baseball." The family dynamic wasn't without its challenges. Years of separation had created gaps that couldn't be bridged overnight. But working together on the Foundation's projects provided common ground, shared purpose that echoed what James Hartley had tried and failed to achieve with his own children. One day, while organizing materials for a new exhibition on barnstorming teams, Rebecca made a discovery that brought the family's story full circle. In a collection donated by a former player's estate, she found a program from a 1962 exhibition game. In the crowd photo, clearly visible, were James and David Hartley. "Look," she called to her parents. "David was wrong when he said his father cared more about cards than family. Here they are together at a game." Rachel studied the photo through a magnifying glass. Young David looked engaged, excited even, pointing at something on the field while his father watched with obvious pride. "Maybe that's the real tragedy," Rachel mused. Not that James chose cards over family, but that both sides remembered only the conflicts, not moments like this. They decided to include the photo in David Hartley's biography on the Foundation website, sending him a copy first. His response was immediate and emotional. "I'd forgotten this day," he wrote. "Actually, I'd forgotten many good days, letting the bad ones overshadow everything. Thank you for reminding me that it wasn't all conflict. There was love too, even if we lost sight of it." The discovery prompted a new Foundation initiative, Recovering Joy, a project focused on finding and sharing positive memories that had been overshadowed by family conflicts. They invited people to contribute photos and stories of happy moments with relatives they'd later become estranged from, creating an archive of love that persisted despite later difficulties. The project resonated deeply. Thousands of submissions poured in photos of fathers and sons at ball games before business failures drove them apart. Mothers and daughters baking together before teenage rebellion created distance. Siblings playing before adult disagreements separated them. "We tend to let our last chapters define the whole story," Emma observed, reviewing submissions. "But every relationship has moments of pure joy. Those deserve to be remembered too." As Rachel and Marcus entered their 80s, they began thinking seriously about succession. The Foundation was well established with professional staff and sustainable funding. Emma was the obvious choice to lead it forward, but they wanted to ensure that the personal touch, the understanding of why stories mattered more than monetary value, would continue. They established the Hartley Thompson Fellowship, bringing in young professionals not just to learn techniques, but to understand the philosophy behind their work. Fellows spent a year working on all aspects of the Foundation, from conservation to community outreach. But most importantly, they learned to see beyond the objects, to the human connections they represented. One fellow, Maria Gonzalez, came from a family of migrant workers. She'd grown up thinking her family had no history worth preserving, no heirlooms, no photo albums, no documented achievements. "Then I learned about the players who weren't allowed to play," she said during her fellowship presentation. "I realized my grandfather, who could hit a baseball farther than anyone in our valley but never had a chance to play professionally. His story matters too. The Foundation taught me that everyone's story matters." Maria went on to establish a program documenting the sports achievements of migrant communities, uncovering stories of informal leagues, legendary players known only in their communities, and the role of sports in creating belonging for displaced populations. Another fellow, Thomas Chin, whose great-grandfather had been excluded from American baseball despite his talent, created an app that allowed people to create digital baseball cards for their own family members, complete with statistics from informal leagues, family games, and community teams. "Not everyone gets a Topps card," Thomas explained, "but everyone who's ever played deserves to be remembered." The app went viral, with millions creating cards for their fathers, mothers, grandparents, and children. Professional designers volunteered to help with layouts. Former players shared tips on posing for photos. What started as a simple idea became a global movement of democratized sports memory. Marcus, watching all this unfold from his increasingly frequent position in his favorite chair at the shop, marveled at how far James Hartley's collection had traveled from that dusty attic. He wanted his cards to teach history, Marcus told Rachel one evening. I don't think he imagined they'd inspire people to make their own history visible. The best legacy, Rachel replied, is one that grows beyond your original vision. On a warm September afternoon, they received a visitor who brought their journey full circle in an unexpected way. A middle-aged man entered the shop, looking uncertain but determined. "Are you the Thompsons?" he asked. "The ones who found the baseball cards?" They confirmed they were, curious about his purpose. "My name is Robert Shaw," he said. "Harrison Shaw was my father." They remembered Harrison Shaw, the CEO of Shaw Sports Memorabilia, who'd offered to buy the entire Hartley collection, sight unseen, whose blank check they'd refused in favor of creating the foundation. "My father passed away last month," Robert continued. "In his will, he left instructions for me to bring you this." He handed them an envelope. Inside was a check for a substantial amount and a letter in Harrison Shaw's handwriting. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, when you refused my offer to buy the Hartley collection, I thought you were fools. I spent months angry at the fortune you were throwing away, the profit that could have been made, but I watched what you did instead. I saw the exhibitions, read about the scholarships, followed the digitization project. You took something I saw only as commodity and revealed it as culture. Your choice changed how I saw my own business. Instead of hoarding the rarest items for the wealthiest collectors, I began programs to make sports history accessible. I funded youth programs in underserved communities. I donated significant portions of my own collection to museums. My accountant said I was crazy. My competitors thought I'd lost my mind. But I learned from you that there are values beyond market value. I'm leaving this donation to support your work because you taught an old dealer that the real treasure isn't in what we keep, but in what we share. Thank you for showing me a better way." Harrison Shaw, Rachel wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. Even in refusing Shaw's offer, they'd planted seeds that grew in ways they'd never known. "Your father sounds like he became a good man," Marcus told Robert. "He did," Robert confirmed, "and I'm trying to continue his evolution. We've restructured the company to focus on preservation and accessibility rather than just profit. Every big sale funds free programs for schools and communities." They talked for hours about the transformation of the memorabilia industry, how the foundation's example had inspired changes throughout the field. Auction houses now included historical context in their catalogs. Collectors funded digitization projects. The artificial scarcity that had driven prices was being challenged by those who understood that sharing increased rather than decreased value. As the shop neared closing time, Emma arrived with her own family, her husband David, and their 2 young children. Rebecca was there too, having decided to stay in Cleveland and work with the foundation full-time. 4 generations gathered in the space that had witnessed so much transformation. "Tell us the story again," Emma's daughter Lucy requested. "About finding the treasure in the attic." So Rachel told it again, the story they'd shared thousands of times, but that never grew old. About the dusty attic on a desperate day, about James Hartley's hidden collection, about choosing purpose over profit. The children listened with the rapt attention that suggested future storytellers learning their craft. And the best part? Rachel concluded, looking around at her family, at the shop filled with preservation projects, at the photos on the walls showing exhibitions and workshops and changed lives, is that the story isn't over. Every time someone saves a family photo, records a grandparent's story, or shares a piece of history, they're adding new chapters. Marcus reached for her hand, thinking of all the stories they'd helped preserve, all the connections they'd facilitated, all the lives touched by their choice to transform a dusty discovery into a living legacy. Outside, the sun was setting over Cleveland, painting the sky in the amber and gold of a baseball card from the Golden Age. Somewhere in the city, in buildings all over the world, people were discovering their own histories, preserving their own treasures. telling their own stories, all because two desperate people had paid $200 for the contents of a dusty attic and chosen to see beyond the dollar signs to the human value within. The James Hartley Foundation would continue long after Rachel and Marcus were gone, run by Emma and Rebecca, supported by thousands who understood that history belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford to buy it. The fellowship program would train new generations. The digitization project would expand to include more sports, more countries, more untold stories. The community workshops would help families preserve their own treasures. But at its heart would always be the simple truth that James Hartley had written in his final letter, do something good with them. Rachel and Marcus Thompson had done something good. They'd taken a lonely man's obsession and transformed it into connection. They'd taken valuable objects and made them invaluable resources. They'd taken their own desperation and alchemized it into hope for others. As the family prepared to leave for the evening, Lucy tugged on Rachel's sleeve. "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to find treasures in attics too." Rachel knelt to meet her great-granddaughter's eyes. "The treasures are everywhere, sweetheart. In attics, yes, but also in photo albums, in stories your elderly neighbors tell, in the games kids play on sandlots. The trick isn't finding treasures, it's recognizing them when you see them and knowing what to do with them." "What should I do with them?" "Share them," Rachel said simply. "Always share them. That's how treasures become miracles." As they locked up the shop and headed home, Rachel thought about James Hartley one last time. Somewhere, she believed, he knew what had become of his collection. He knew that his cards had finally done what he'd always hoped, brought people together, taught history, created connections across generations and cultures. The dusty attic had yielded its treasure, but the real discovery had been understanding that true wealth lay not in possession, but in generosity, not in keeping, but in giving, not in the value of objects, but in the values they could teach. And that discovery, Rachel knew, was worth more than all the baseball cards ever printed, all the money ever offered, all the treasures ever hidden in all the attics in the world. It was worth a life well lived, a legacy well shared, and a story that would continue being told as long as there were people curious enough to explore dusty spaces and wise enough to recognize that the greatest treasures are those that bring us together. The years that followed brought both expected passages and surprising revelations. Marcus's health began to decline first, a gradual slowing that he met with characteristic stoicism. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp, and he continued teaching conservation techniques from his wheelchair, his hands still steady as he demonstrated proper handling of fragile documents. "The body is just paper," he told his students during what would be his final workshop. "It yellows, it tears, it crumbles, but the stories it carries, those can be preserved forever if we're careful." He passed on a quiet Tuesday morning, Rachel holding his hand, Emma and Rebecca at his side. His funeral filled the Cleveland Museum of Art, where the foundation held a special exhibition of items he'd personally conserved over the years. Each piece represented not just an object saved, but a story preserved, a family heritage protected, a connection maintained across time. David Hartley spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he recalled how Marcus had helped him understand his father's legacy. Marcus Thompson didn't just preserve baseball cards. He preserved the possibility of reconciliation, of understanding, of seeing beyond our mistakes to the love that endures. Rachel, now alone for the first time in over 50 years, threw herself even deeper into the foundation's work. But she also began a personal project, one that Marcus had always encouraged, but that she'd never had time to pursue. She started writing down her own story, not just the discovery in the attic, but the whole journey of a life spent finding and sharing treasures. The memoir, when published, became an unexpected bestseller. The attic resonated with readers who saw their own family stories reflected in its pages. The royalties, naturally, went to the foundation, funding a new program that helped families write and preserve their own histories. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside the shop window, Rachel received a package with no return address. Inside was a single baseball card, a 1,948 Leaf Jackie Robinson, along with a handwritten note. My grandfather was at Ebbets Field the day Robinson played his first game. He bought this card that same year and kept it in his wallet until he died. He used to say that Robinson's courage gave him the strength to fight his own battles as a black man in America. I've held on to it for 20 years, but after reading your book, I realize it doesn't belong in my drawer. It belongs where it can inspire others. Please add it to the Foundation's collection so my grandfather's story can continue. Anonymous Rachel held the card carefully, understanding that she was holding not just cardboard and ink, but decades of hope, struggle, and triumph. This was why they'd done it all, to be trusted with these stories, to be caretakers of memory. As her own 85th birthday approached, Rachel made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She announced that she would be taking one final trip to explore attics and estate sales, not to find valuable objects, but to document the stories of other collectors, other preservers of history who, like James Hartley, might be misunderstood in their passions. Emma and Rebecca worried about her traveling alone at her age, but Rachel was adamant. "This is how Marcus and I started," she said. "It's how I want to finish looking for treasures, finding stories." She bought a small RV and set off with a research assistant, spending a year crisscrossing the country. In Tulsa, she found a woman who'd spent 50 years collecting memorabilia from the Negro League's Indianapolis Clowns, preserving the history of a team that had been dismissed as mere entertainment but had launched Hank Aaron's career. In Portland, she met a man whose garage housed 30,000 vintage postcards, each one carefully cataloged with information about the sender, recipient, and historical context. His neighbors thought him eccentric, but Rachel saw a historian documenting American life one postcard at a time. In Miami, she discovered a Cuban exile who'd smuggled out baseball cards of Cuban players when he fled in 1962, preserving a piece of sports history that the revolution had tried to erase. Each collector received the same gift: validation that their passion mattered, assistance in organizing and preserving their collections, and connections to institutions that could help share their treasures with the world. The Foundation created a new division dedicated to supporting individual collectors, recognizing that every person preserving history deserves support, not judgment. Rachel's final stop was the most meaningful. She returned to the Victorian House in Cleveland, where it all began. The Foundation had maintained it as a museum and teaching center, but the attic remained untouched, preserved as it was the day she and Marcus had first climbed those stairs. Standing in that dusty space, surrounded by empty boxes and abandoned furniture, Rachel could almost feel Marcus beside her, could almost hear James Hartley's hope echoing in the rafters. She thought of all the lives changed because two desperate people had been willing to pay $200 for the contents of this room. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty space. "Thank you for trusting us with your treasure." She descended the stairs one last time, knowing her work was nearly done. Emma and Rebecca would carry the Foundation forward. The thousands of people touched by their programs would continue preserving and sharing stories. The philosophy that treasures were meant to be shared, not hoarded, had taken root in communities around the world. Rachel lived another 3 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren begin their own collections, not of valuable objects, but of family stories recorded on phones, of interviews with elderly neighbors, of traditions preserved and shared. She saw the Foundation's influence spread to other countries, other cultures, all united by the belief that everyone's history mattered. Her final days were spent in the apartment above the shop, surrounded by the things she and Marcus had saved over the years. Not the valuable items, those had all been donated or sold for good causes, but the personal treasures, photos of exhibitions, letters from people whose stories had been preserved, that Roberto Clemente card from Maria Santos. Emma sat with her during those last days, recording one final oral history. Rachel spoke of Marcus, of finding love at an estate sale, of building a life around shared passion. She spoke of Emma herself, of the pride she felt watching her daughter transform from a college dropout to a nationally recognized leader in public history. She spoke of second chances and unexpected gifts, of choosing purpose over profit. The real treasure, Rachel said, her voice still clear despite her body's frailty, was never the baseball cards. It was discovering that we had the power to transform loss into gain, to turn one man's lonely obsession into a movement that connected millions. Every attic holds that potential. Every forgotten box contains the possibility of connection. We just have to be brave enough to look. She passed peacefully on a spring morning, the shop below already bustling with people learning to preserve their own treasures. Her funeral, like Marcus's, filled the museum, but this time the exhibition featured not objects but stories, thousands of them, submitted by people whose lives had been touched by the Thompsons' choice to share rather than sell. The foundation created the Rachel and Marcus Thompson Memorial Archive, dedicated to preserving the stories of preservers themselves, the collectors, archivists, and family historians who ensure that memory survives. Emma announced it at her mother's memorial service, her voice strong despite her tears. My parents taught us that every object has a story, but more importantly, that every story has value. They showed us that the greatest treasure isn't what we keep for ourselves, but what we make accessible to others. In their memory, we commit to continuing this work, to climbing into every dusty attic, real or metaphorical, and finding the treasures that connect us all. The James Hartley Foundation continued to grow, its influence, spreading far beyond baseball cards or even sports memorabilia. It became a model for democratizing history, for recognizing that culture belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford to buy it. Universities created programs based on its principles. Museums restructured their missions to prioritize access over acquisition. Families around the world began seeing their photo albums and heirlooms not as clutter, but as archives worthy of preservation. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, much like the one when Rachel and Marcus had first entered that dusty attic, a young couple stood before the same Victorian house. They had driven 3 hours from Columbus, following a lead about an estate sale. The current owners, descendants of distant Hartley relatives, were clearing out the basement. Previous buyers picked through the main floors, the estate sale coordinator explained. But the basement's still sealed. No one's been down there in decades. $200 takes everything as is. Where is? The young woman, an art history student named Sophia, felt a familiar tingle of possibility. Her partner James, despite their tight budget, saw the hope in her eyes. "We'll take it," Sophia declared, fishing crumpled 20s from her purse. As they descended the basement stairs, neither knew they were following in Rachel and Marcus Thompson's footsteps. They didn't know that the house above them had once held the Hartley collection, or that their willingness to risk $200 on the unknown connected them to a legacy of treasure hunters who understood that value wasn't always measured in dollars. In the basement, they found boxes of old photographs, letters from the 1,920 and a collection of jazz recordings that documented a forgotten chapter of Cleveland's musical history. It wasn't worth millions like the baseball cards had been, but Sophia and James understood instinctively what Rachel and Marcus had discovered decades earlier. The real treasure wasn't in what they could sell, but in the stories they could share. They contacted the James Hartley Foundation, which helped them preserve and digitize the collection. The jazz recordings revealed connections between Cleveland and New Orleans musicians that historians had never documented. The photographs showed integrated jazz clubs that challenged narratives about segregation in the North. The letters told love stories that crossed racial and class boundaries in ways that defied their era's conventions. Sophia and James became the newest generation of treasure hunters, following the path blazed by the Thompsons. They opened their own shop, specializing in preserving musical history, teaching workshops on archiving family recordings, helping communities document their sonic heritage. And in their shop window, they hung a small sign that Rachel would have loved. Every attic holds a symphony. Every basement contains a ballad. We help you find the music in your memories. The cycle continued, as it always had, and always would. In attics and basements, in forgotten boxes and abandoned albums, treasures waited for those brave enough to look beyond the dust to the dreams beneath. The James Hartley Foundation stood ready to help, but the real work happened in moments like Sophia and James's, when someone paid a small price for the unknown and discovered that the greatest treasures are always meant to be shared. In the end, Rachel and Marcus Thompson's legacy wasn't measured in dollars, though the foundation's endowment eventually surpassed $1 billion through donations from those inspired by their story. It wasn't measured in objects preserved, though millions of items were saved from destruction through their programs. It was measured in connections made, stories shared, and lives changed, because two people understood that the true value of any treasure lies not in what it's worth, but in what it means. The dusty attic in Cleveland still stands, still welcomes visitors who want to understand where it all began. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the light slants just right through that octagonal window, staff members swear they can feel a presence there, not ghostly, but warm and encouraging, as if James Hartley, Marcus, and Rachel are all nodding in approval at each new person who climbs those stairs, ready to discover that the greatest treasures are always meant to be shared. And somewhere in attics and basements around the world, new treasures wait to be discovered by those brave enough to look beyond the dust to the dreams underneath, wise enough to understand that every preserved memory is a gift to the future, and generous enough to share what they find with a world hungry for connection. The story that began with desperation in a dusty attic continues every time someone saves a family photo, records a grandparent's voice, or chooses to see treasure where others see trash. Rachel and Marcus Thompson prove that transformation is always possible, that purpose can emerge from loss, and that the richest people are those who enrich others. Their message echoes in every preserved story, every shared treasure, every connection made across time and space. Some things are too precious to keep for ourselves. The real treasure is always in the sharing. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and click on one of the 2 amazing stories on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.